This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
The very start of the study, we just took a knockout sample, we measured the IBU, and we were shocked to find that the IBUs were well above 100 when the target was 70. So then we realized we're losing a lot during fermentation. But the biggest surprise from this was how fast it happened. Without fail, within 2 days, you are losing that 30% IBU.
This week on the show, my pal Aaron Justice from Ballast Point is back to lead us on an awesome journey tracking IBUs throughout the brewing process. This episode is full of surprises, and I guarantee you're going to learn something. I'm also linking to the TQ article where you can find Aaron's IBU equations based on the study. You took on a major project in which you closely tracked IBUs throughout your brewing process at 3 different breweries. Tell us how this all came about.
I was sitting in a room full of quality analysts, and we're kind of going over our critical beer specs. We go over ABV, IBU, SRM, and kind of just have this roundtable discussion about why any one of our core brands would be out of spec. And I remember we were off our typical IBU for one of our core brands by, I don't know, 15. And I remember someone looking at me and saying, how could this possibly happen? And he was just being, honest with me.
Did you tell him it's because you're wrong half of the time because you used to work in the weather industry, or what?
Exactly. Yeah. I wish I could keep my job if I'm wrong half the time. Anyway, enough about the weather. But yeah, so he was just being honest with me, and I thought about it. I honestly didn't have an answer. I don't like. I get IBU calculations, how they're gained and lost a little bit, but not actual quantifiable numbers. Stuff that you can use and say, well, if it's off by 15, it's possible that he or she missed a Whirlpool edition or a 60-minute hop edition. And if that were the case, then how do you fix that problem? So this started a few years ago, and kind of turned into this massive project that we kind of started and are still doing.
This was going on at 3 different breweries. Is it worth talking about the differences of the 3 setups a little bit?
Yeah, they are different facilities, a little bit here and there. The one that I worked at, this is our Scripps Ranch facility. It was the initial production facility. It's a 3-vessel brew house. We have an infusion mash tun, a kettle, and a Whirlpool, kind of your standard setup. And we had flow meters on it. We had flow meters for water coming into the mash tun. We had a flow meter from the mash tun to kettle, and then from kettle to Whirlpool, and then, of course, from Whirlpool to fermenter. Kind of the same setup at our Miramar facility, which is our new production facility. we have a 150 barrel brew house and a 300 barrel brew house, but most of the data was taken from the 150, which kind of was similar to our Scripps Ranch facility. And that has a lauter ton and a wort receiver, but for the most part, at least for this study, we were focusing on kettle and whirlpool. So kind of the same setup. Whereas for our R&D facility, which is a 5-barrel facility, it's just a mash tun and a kettle. So it's direct fire, and we whirlpool inside the kettle.
All right. So just how much did utilization vary between the different brew house sizes? Did you have that data? Were you brewing the same recipes at each location?
We were. And I would say that the direct fire had, generally speaking, less utilization because the boils weren't as rigorous. The other 2 locations have an external calandria, so you get a lot of mixing during the boil. And with these bigger systems, you have a longer knockout as well. So you have a little bit more contact time with the hops in the whirlpool, a little bit more momentum in the whirlpool, so you get a lot more mixing in the whirlpool, whereas on a smaller system, you just really don't have that. And, you knock out a 5-barrel batch in 20 minutes. So generally speaking, yes, the bigger systems, we had better utilization.
Okay, we've probably all read about the factors that affect hop utilization, like wort gravity and pH. Talk about some of these factors and which ones turned out to matter the most in your breweries.
Without a doubt, it was hop rate. In fact, that was kind of the sleeper of this study, was that hop rate has a huge impact. So if you're using a pound per barrel hot side hops, you're going to get really less utilization. Wort gravity definitely has an impact. We noticed that there's a pretty strong correlation. Wort IBU, as the wort IBU approaches 100, you see a dramatic plateauing of utilization because you're hitting a saturation point. pH, to be honest, because wort pH doesn't vary that much. I mean, you're going to go from anywhere from 4.9 to as high as maybe 5.6. There really wasn't that strong of a correlation. And time, of course. Time was a fairly big one. With the study, though, we found that usually within the first 5 to 10 minutes, you're picking up almost most of the IBUs you're going to get from that hop charge.
Yeah, that was a big surprise to me to see that. This was a very thorough study. You looked at mash hops, you looked at 60-minute additions, you looked at whirlpool additions, you looked at wet hops, studied IBU loss throughout the process. So let's start with the mash hops. I guess you wanted to know how much bitterness those additions were getting. Talk about that.
And this is something that's heavily debated in the industry, especially even in our own brewery, because a lot of people thought, well, what is this actually doing? So, because a lot of people say, well, you're just flushing these hops down the toilet, but that's not the case. We found
I've probably said that.
Yeah. We found that there was even a sensory from our sensory panel. We did notice at least a little bit of a difference between non-mash hop and mash hop. But I think the biggest difference that you're going to get is, yes, you're going to get IBUs. And if you use a high alpha hop, and if you're doing about a half pound per barrel of that high alpha hop, you could get 20, maybe 30 IBUs from mash hopping. And I remember when I started home brewing, in the early 2000s, people say, oh, no, mash hops add nothing. They don't add any IBUs, but that's not the case. You do get a decent amount. We were seeing utilizations anywhere from about 8 to 10%.
And you saw that utilization drop as the hop rate went up there as well, right?
We did. It seems like also as the brew progressed and we got to the knockout, it kind of all started to kind of level out. And I don't know if it was because we were approaching a saturation point, or if we were starting to see a little bit of thermal degradation of those hop compounds through the process, because you're throwing them in at dough in. that's a long period of high temperatures to those hops. So I don't know for sure, but it's something that we've noticed, and we've done this study so many times now. But there is kind of a leveling of the playing field as you go through the brewing process.
Let's talk about the 60-minute additions. What did you want to learn there?
First and foremost, I think what we wanted to do was find out what were our knockout IBUs, so that we can kind of get a benchmark to see then how much we were going to lose through fermentation. So with 60-minute additions, we wanted to see how fast we were going to pick up the IBUs and how much, like what was that utilization. And we were really surprised. If you're doing a Scottish ale where you're hopping at about 0.1 pounds per barrel, you're going to get about 60% utilization. Whereas if you're doing an Imperial Red, which was one of our brews, which is super high gravity and the hop rate is outrageous, your utilization is going to drop below 20%. So we kind of wanted to see that, and we did 30-minute additions and 10-minute additions, but we found that they behaved very similarly to 60-minute additions. So we kind of just pushed those aside, the 30-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute additions, and just focused solely on the 60-minute addition.
Talk more about what you observed in regards to the utilization over time.
So for 60-minute, again, within the first 5 minutes, you're picking up the vast majority of your IBUs. It's not even close. So you'll see a utilization increase through that boil, and you can see a utilization increase by maybe 5 to 10%, which is still substantial. But that first 5 minutes is critical.
Were you surprised by that? That definitely surprised me.
It is very surprising because I think with the 60-minute addition, if you're picking up all your IBUs within the first 5 minutes, I think your first inclination is to think, well, gosh, why not just throw it in at 15 minutes?
Yeah.
You get most of your IBUs, and you also get flavor and aroma.
Right.
And that was my first takeaway from those 60-minute additions, and just how high the utilization was. I was really surprised by that. I didn't think it was going to be that high.
You've got some words of caution for those substituting high alpha additions with lower alpha additions. What's that all about?
We did that separate study where we talked about where we increased hop rate on one specific blonde ale, where we used Polaris at a hop rate of 0.1 and Tettnang at a hop rate of 1.2 pounds per barrel, and the utilization dropped from 45% with the Polaris and dropped down to 30% with the Tettnang. And I thought that was really important because I think I hear a lot of people in the industry say, well, when you're doing 60-minute additions, you can substitute any hop because you're going to boil off any aroma and flavor from those hops. But if you're going to substitute a lower alpha hop for a higher alpha hop, just realize that your utilization is going to drop significantly.
Coming up,
all the other IBU calculators that you get online or anywhere else really focus on work gravity and the amount of boiling time. So I wanted to take this data and try to come up with an equation that maybe would be a little bit better at predicting IBUs.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Whitcomb Solinsky McAuliffe PC serves all brewers in registering and protecting trademarks, navigating the label approval process, and assisting with OSHA inspections and safety compliance. Please go to wsmlawpc.com for more information.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Carolinas is holding a social at Highland Brewing in Asheville during the South Atlantic Hops Conference March 16th. Maybe I'll see you there. District Michigan meets at the Knickerbocker in Grand Rapids March 21st. District Eastern Canada meets in Montreal March 21st. District St. Louis also meets March 21st at Urban Chestnuts Grove location. Don't miss the Maintaining a Clean Brewery webinar March 28th. Several districts meet the last weekend in March. District Texas is in San Antonio. District Mid-Atlantic is at Basic City Brewing in Waynesboro, Virginia. And District Midwest is at Rheingeist in Cincinnati. It's not too early to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. All right, let's move on to the Whirlpool editions. What did you want to learn about those?
Again, I remember when I first started homebrewing, people would say, "Oh, you get almost no IBUs from Whirlpool." Once I became a commercial brewer, I quickly realized that wasn't the case. Once we could actually measure IBUs, we realized that you're getting a lot of bitterness from the Whirlpool edition. With Whirlpool, just like 60 Minute, we found that you pick up most of your IBUs within the first 5 to 10 minutes of contact time. But with Whirlpool, time really didn't matter. If you think about it, you throw your Whirlpool hops in, and they swirl around and quickly, settle into the middle and drop to the bottom, and then you're knocking out, and so you're not really seeing this agitation that you're seeing during the boil. So we found that with Whirlpool hops, time really doesn't matter. What we did find was hop rate was a big one, and with the way people hop nowadays, a pound per barrel in the Whirlpool is becoming almost standard for hoppy beers. And we found that hopping rate had a substantial effect on utilization, probably the biggest effect. Gravity also had an impact. We found that the lower gravity beers, there was almost no correlation. From about 10 to 13 Plato, we found almost no correlation. And there's been previous studies that have kind of shown that. But once you start to get to higher gravities, above 13 Plato, you're going to start to see a tighter correlation and a decrease in utilization. And another one that we found was that wort IBU. So if the wort IBU going into that Whirlpool is higher, especially once you start approaching that 100 IBU, you're going to get almost nothing out of those hops. The utilization will drop to almost 10%.
Wow. And the results that you saw, again, they were pretty similar between the different breweries, right?
They were. Again, the big breweries, you get more agitation. There's more momentum in those Whirlpools. You're pumping at a faster rate. The thermal, charge, the heat, is retained in such a huge vessel. We were getting significantly higher utilization, but it was still fairly high on the smaller system as well. So Whirlpool hops are a thing. They definitely add anywhere as low as 20% utilization to as high as 44% utilization, which is a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, you also studied some wet hop additions. Talk about that.
This one was fun, and we've done this a couple times. But with wet hops, because they obviously have way more moisture than kiln hops, you have to assume that the the alpha is going to be about 1/4 the amount of a pelletized hop. So that's how we kind of calculated the utilization. But we put 400 pounds of wet hops, cascades, into our mash tun, pumped from the kettle into the mash tun. Obviously, we saw a temperature drop. Temperature dropped into the 190s, but we pumped all the wort from the kettle into the mash tun, steeped it for 20 minutes, and then transferred over to the whirlpool from the mash tun. So the rest time, was about 45 to 50 minutes, and we saw about 8% utilization for that beer. Particularly, we saw about a 32 IBU pickup just from steeping with wet hops.
Going beyond the brew house, you determined the average loss of IBUs for the 14 beers that you analyzed was almost 34% during fermentation, maturation, and filtration. Was that a surprise?
That was a big surprise. I think when we started doing this study, the very start of the study, we just took a knockout sample, we measured the IBU, and we were shocked to find that the IBUs were well above 100 when the target was 70. So then we realized we're losing a lot during fermentation. But the biggest surprise from this was how fast it happened. Without fail, within 2 days, you are losing that 30% IBU. Once you pass that high Krausen and you start to head towards conditioning and maturation, there really isn't that big of a change in IBU. Even if you're doing kind of a light dry hop, and when I say light dry hop, nowadays a pound per barrel is kind of a light dry hop. Whereas, we'll talk about it in a second, but, once you start getting to 3, it starts getting interesting. But, a pound per barrel really doesn't affect IBUs. Then filtration, you get to filtration, and, if we only centrifuge a beer, we would see about 5% further loss. If you do centrifuge and a polishing filter, you could see as high as a 15% loss.
And you saw this loss was greater, I think, in the beers that had those real heavy whirlpool additions, right?
It is, and it's something that I want to study. We don't have HPLC, but I'm definitely going to send this off to another lab to get this. But we found that if a beer relies heavily on whirlpool IBUs, you see a quick loss during fermentation and even filtration. So I'm curious to see what specific compound is being lost. I don't know if it's humulinone or if it's isohumulone versus isocohumulone. I don't have that answer, but it is something that we observe for sure.
Do you want to say more about the loss from like yeast and stuff? I feel like we didn't really talk about that very much. Is that worth talking about or not? I mean, it's in your paper, but doesn't mean we have to talk about it here. But
actually, I totally forgot about that too. Holy smokes! Another thing. Okay, so we found that you get IBU loss in the first 2 days of fermentation, but the amount of IBU loss did depend on how flocculent that yeast was. If it's a low flocculent yeast and it stayed in suspension, like a wit yeast, we used Sac Trois, and we found from those 2 yeast strains specifically, even some lager strains, we were getting more IBU loss. The other thing we found was if it's a higher gravity beer, so you get a more rigorous, longer fermentation, and you get a little bit more biomass building in that fermenter, you're going to get also bigger losses in IBUs from those type of beers.
we had Dr. May on the show way back on episode 4, and he talked about how dry hopping can increase or decrease IBUs depending on conditions. What was your experience?
Oh yeah, when we started doing hazies, and we're playing around with hazies where we would double dry hop, we'd have an initial hop charge, day 1, day 2 fermentation, and then another one at terminal gravity. We were seeing big increases in IBU. I'm talking anywhere from 20, maybe even 30 IBU increase with each one of those hop charges. We've even done beers now where they're dry hop only, and we dry hop at terminal gravity, and we've seen an increase 30 to 40 IBUs, and we're dry hopping at about 3 to 4 pounds per barrel.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that. So I know you said you or the paper indicated that you brewed a couple of hazy session IPAs that had no kettle hops, and so dry hopping only. What did the data look like on those? What numbers did you see there?
Yeah, those were the ones that easily picked up anywhere. We saw a range from about 25 to as high as 40 IBUs, and it really depends on what hops you're using. I couldn't find a correlation. I mean, we haven't done the study enough, but obviously the alpha content is going to impact that, because that could correlate to humilinone amounts. But with the dry hop only, we relied solely on our bitterness were solely coming from those humilinones. But that was the whole point of the beer. We added no kettle hops. We found that kettle hops kind of negatively impact haze stability. I can't believe I'm even talking about haze stability. But we found that hot side hops impact haze stability. So we didn't want to add any hot side hops. And so we just focused just on dry hop. And we wanted to pick up most of our bitterness coming from that dry hop charge at the end of fermentation. And the one that where we did Centennial at 4 pounds per barrel, we saw a 40 IBU pickup.
What was the sensory bitterness like in that beer?
It's super soft. It's like what people describe it as, especially when you're using so much wheat. I've noticed that when you use wheat, you're introducing those proteins, which can kind of impact your perception of bitterness. But it's definitely a softer bitterness. That is without a doubt.
Cool. As I was reading through your paper, I got, a little more than halfway through, and I jotted down a question to ask you whether or not anyone has built a model for predicting IBU that takes all these factors into account. And then I got down to the bottom, and I learned that you have worked on that yourself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. I figured that, and this is something I've always wanted to work on, because all the other IBU calculators that you get online or anywhere else really focus on work gravity and the amount of boiling time. So I wanted to take this data and try to come up with an equation that maybe would be a little bit better at predicting IBUs, not only for knockout, but then for finished product. I realized, you're going to have to treat kettle hops different from whirlpool hops. With kettle hops, you focus on hop rate, work gravity, and time. And really, hop rate's probably the biggest impact. It has the biggest impact on utilization. Whereas for the whirlpool, focused on hopping rate again, I removed time out of the equation, because for the most part, you pick up your IBUs in the first 10 minutes, and it just doesn't make a difference. So remove time out of the equation. So you have, again, hopping rate, gravity, and wort IBU as it comes into the whirlpool. And those are the three factors that affect your whirlpool utilization. So I separated those two. And I have to admit, I'm not a statistician. I took a lot of math in college for meteorology, but man, I had to painstakingly go through and write this equation and try to match the data as much as possible. So that took a lot of time, but I will say that at least this equation worked for our Scripps Ranch location. We were getting our targets within about 5 IBU, and we were brewing a wide variety of beer styles. We were doing a lot of one-off brews, just weird, crazy stuff, high gravity, low gravity stuff, and the equation for the most part worked. So I know that it's not a universal equation. Every brewery is going to be unique, but at the very least, this is a start, and you can kind of take this and tailor it to your brewery. That was the whole point of me kind of sharing this with everyone.
That's pretty cool. And listeners who want to check out those equations, they can find those in the Technical Quarterly article, which you can find on the Master Brewers website, and we'll also link to it in the show notes here. Aaron, we know that IBUs don't correlate to sensory bitterness, and the IBU test was never designed for the type of beers most craft brewers are making these days. So I got to ask, are we just wasting our time with the wrong type of analysis for hoppy beers?
That's funny you asked that, because I wanted to kind of start off the entire paper, and even when I gave this talk at the Brewing Summit, I wanted to start off saying that this measurement of IBU is not probably the best technique, and the reason why is that the IBU test measures anything that's soluble in isooctane and absorbs at 275 nanometers. So we found that something like pumpkin spices or bitter orange peel would actually add IBUs to specific beers. So and this doesn't always correlate to sensory bitterness. So with all that said, when you think about the spectrophotometer and measuring IBU, we used it more as a critical control point to verify that the beer is the same as it was when we brewed it last week. And it will allow us to kind of be more predictive of what to expect possibly with a beer that we're going to brew in the future, whether we're scaling it from a home brew or a 5-barrel batch or commissioning a new brew house on the East Coast. I look forward to hearing people's feedback, and I look forward to seeing other people's studies. I want people to just share their information and be passionate about brewing.
That was Aaron Justice here on the Master Brewers podcast. I know you want to see Aaron's IBU calculator, so check out the link to his TQ article in the show notes, or just type Quest for Consistency into the industry's best search bar at MBAA.com. Did you know that Master Brewers now has a mobile app? TQ articles, podcasts, webinars, Ask the Brewmasters, and more, all in the same place. Search Master Brewers in the App Store to download it now.
I'm moving too fast, and then I hit on the ground. Just like that one day when we came around then. Since there's that one thing